Bloodborne is a masterpiece, one of my favorite games of all time. Old school horror imagery with tight Souls combat, Lovecraftian lore without that pesky racism. Bloodborne, a bona fide classic. So when I heard it was coming to the PC, I was ecstatic. Bloodborne on PC. But this wasn't exactly what I had in mind. A PlayStation 1 boot up and a fan software logo. Nice. This lovingly crafted Demake of From Software's 2015 classic was created in 13 months by Lilith Walter. In it, players explore Yharnam, the first area of the original, in a classic PlayStation 1 style. Now, this might sound limited to those expecting a full recreation of the game, but there have been more than a handful of changes made here, with a generous amount of surprises in store. Most of the major set pieces are here, but navigating the world is a bit different. There are more locked doors to prohibit progression, and keys play an important part this time around. In a lot of ways, Bloodborne PSX is a lot more linear, which is a good thing considering how densely packed everything is. The developer has done an excellent job cordoning off certain areas in a way that feels natural. It retains the same sense of exploration, but in an old school way. As you explore the streets, alleys, and sewers of Yharnam, you'll be expected to gain insight to unlock new areas within the hunter's dream. It's important to search every nook and cranny for upgrades, which is easier said than done, as loading screens are much more prevalent. Those who are unfamiliar with classic polygonal game worlds might find these frequent breaks disorienting, but it shouldn't take long before the environments start making sense geographically. There's also an option to disable these load times altogether, which I found myself toggling in the denser areas, especially in a few of the longer stretches where I was dying more than usual attempting to suss out the next path of progression. There are tons of options here to fiddle around with, including a hefty amount of visual modes. On my first playthrough, I went with the default, which presents everything in a blurry, stylized PlayStation 1 fashion, running at 20 FPS. Normally, I'm not a huge fan of retro television filters, but what's here is great, and offered a huge amount of authenticity to this package. There's just so much to toy around with here, including a crisp, clear remaster mode, and the ability to run everything in a higher frame rate. I'd encourage players to consider the default settings for at least a bit, but if you simply can't stomach the muddier style or warping, the choice is yours to customize things to your preference. When it comes to creating a character, things are much more limited. Starting classes are still available, but there aren't a lot of choices when it comes to designing a hunter, which is totally fine. I mean, I typically just go with a bald guy with a big bushy beard anyway, but if you're the type of person who spends a ton of time designing the perfect protagonist, you'll likely be disappointed. Basically, you have the choice to look like a Twitch streamer, complete with a crayon box variety of hair colors, and that's it. Unfortunately, the majority of the faces look the same, but there are a few voice options to mess around with. The majority of the audio bits have been repurposed from the PlayStation 4 original, but the music has been replaced with a brand new score performed by a handful of artists. From what I can tell, the majority of the pieces were composed by Ryan Amon and arranged by Evelyn Lark, with a few others lending their talents throughout. It's an incredibly ambitious soundtrack from top to bottom that perfectly complements the 32-bit visuals. I really don't know how to explain it, but there's a late 90s feel to the music that just works really well. It's a lot less orchestral with a more video game vibe. The bigger, bombastic numbers sound like something from an early Castlevania entry, with catchy, haunting melodies. It's really quite wonderful. All of the cutscenes have also been redone, and yeah, they look awesome. Now, I probably sound like a broken record here, but this is just a really great fan game. The way she has managed to recapture the magic that is the Father Gascoigne fight is simply remarkable, and just look at this cool pose. Give me a lucky strike and a pint of bourbon, and I'll be good to go. When it comes to presentation, this thing is perfect. It knows exactly what it's doing, and I'm all on board with it. Bad ass.
I can even die human. But before I take this...
Control-wise, it's a PlayStation 1 game with all of the good and the bad. It's designed with the original controller in mind, before the days of twin analog sticks, meaning camera maneuverability is extremely limited. Rotating the view is done with the left and right triggers, which was commonplace back in the 90s, but thankfully it's possible to reset the perspective quickly on the fly with a tap of the action button, the X if we're talking Sony. This also acts as your lock-on, since there aren't any sticks to depress, as well as the input for interacting with everything. Occasionally, things got a bit hairy in the midst of combat due to so many functions being assigned to the singular button. Like, I'd be in the middle of a skirmish and want to lock on to an enemy, but there was an item in the way, forcing a frustrating obstruction leading to a death, though honestly, these clunky moments just made me appreciate this Bloodborne Demake even more, since they really do replicate what it feels like to play a game from that era. Sure, it's a bit tanky to spin your character around, and I'd often get myself cornered due to the slow camera speed, but it's on par for the 32-bit course. I'll admit that being stun-locked by a small group of enemies for the 27th time did start to grate on my nerves. Baddies in this thing have an unnatural ability to freeze you in your steps and chip away at your health bar in an annoying flurry of unavoidable attacks, and it's probably my biggest complaint when it comes to this thing. Just kill me and be done with it. On the plus side, the camera is reliable when it comes to moving around. It shows a different perspective when sneaking along planks of wood, and will even show you what's below if you creep up to the edge of a higher vantage point. R1 still attacks, the circle, sprints, and dodges. I used an Xbox controller, but for the sake of consistency, we'll refer to the inferior PlayStation layout. The triangle remains the blood vial button, smash that shit into your leg, but it also doubles as your quick item input, which is an odd decision. Square now serves as a walk when held down, which helps a bit when you want to sneak up on an enemy or balance along tight beams, but I think I would have preferred it to have been left for the items. The Molotov cocktails are extremely powerful here, made even more useful due to the relatively limited mobility, and having to swap them in felt a tad cumbersome. Breaking out your janitor's ring of keys to manually cycle through the appropriate fit for a door was also a nice nod to the days of yore, but these too need to be assigned to the bloated items menu. It's not a big deal, but if I had to make a nitpick, I think I would have opted for another action button instead of a slower walk. The AI is dumb, like real dumb at times, but hey, at least this thing gives you a fighting chance, because if you mess things up with bloodstones, you're kinda screwed until later on in the game, but more on that in a bit.
Help me!
Almost everything is done through the menu, transforming weapons, assigning tools to the triangle, swapping outfits. These are sexy screens presented in that classic PlayStation 1 style. Cheats are even available for you die-hard mid-90s gamers out there. Everything is big, bold, detailed, and easy to understand. This goes for all of the on-screen text as well. Unlike new games, you won't need a monocular to see what has been written, which is so refreshing as an old man with deteriorating eyesight. The combat feels good. It's not as swift or accurate as that from the original, but it gets the job done. Backstabs are pretty easy to pull off by charging R1 from behind, but I found it much more inconsistent to get a parry to land. The window seems a bit less generous here in this Bloodborne Demake, but dodging is still reliable, so this kind of makes up for it. New areas have been introduced within the city of Yharnam. As you progress the plot, the environment changes quite a bit, making this feel like its own thing. basement library can be unlocked at one point, where we get to see the dogs and crows being created. When the enemy info card pops up, these abominations are described with a series of question marks, which is a nice touch. Traveling deeper into this region also allows the player to read information and lore about characters, creatures, and weapons. Quite a few armaments have been recreated for this game, but there are a couple of surprises, such as the shotgun, which is a devastating, satisfying beast to get a hold of. I'm trying my best not to spoil too much endgame stuff here, but let's just say it gets very survival horror with a surprising end boss. Due to the condensed nature of the project, you'll only be able to upgrade weapons to +5. Smithing tools are found throughout the world, mostly tucked away behind packs of enemies or obstacles, which gives this thing a bit of a Metroid feel. The variety and amount of baddies has been scaled back significantly, but they're all deliberately placed throughout the city. All of those familiar Bloodborne beats are here, but things have been tweaked quite a bit, which is a point I keep making in different ways, but I really can't stress how different this project is compared to the official release. There's enough here to keep veterans of the original on their toes, and more than a handful of clever twists that play out as you dig deeper into the story. I hinted at this before, but I'd advise not spending those bloodstones prematurely. I messed up one of my runs by accidentally placing one of the smaller upgrades into a weapon I wasn't planning on using, which resulted in a situation where I had gathered chunks and twin shards without being able to bump my shit up past the +1 mark. This probably won't make sense to those of you who haven't played a Souls game, but just trust me when I suggest waiting until you've found your go-to weapon before wasting tools at the bench. Later on in the game, this becomes a non-issue, but it's like at the very end of the game. This isn't all that big of a deal, it just means you'll have to chip away at enemies and bosses a little bit longer if you're not able to level up, but at least it's still possible to give the pig a colonoscopy.
Salty.
Enemies respawn after each loading screen, which is a big change, but it keeps the action going. At first I found this a bit of an annoyance since it made it harder for me to get my bearings, but I warmed up to it after a while. As I said, the amount of baddies has been scaled back, so if they didn't reappear, Yharnam would be an empty place after a lengthy run. New obstacles have been introduced, as well as a few hunters peppered throughout in well thought out places. There were a few areas where I'd walk into a new section only to be greeted by a foe immediately. These instances don't occur frequently enough to be a problem, but sometimes they'd knock me back to the previous screen, or I'd accidentally do it myself by trying to dodge out of the way of one of their attacks. It can be a tad irritating when this happens, but again, this is designed to be a throwback game. Throughout my half a dozen or so playthroughs, I've experienced a myriad of glitches. Some environmental stuff occurs, a few weird spazzy movements happened, and I've had the cleric beast's life bar break altogether. The game has never crashed though, and none of these experiences were enough to straight up ruin my run. It's probably important to note that there is no multiplayer whatsoever, but that's a given. I'm only mentioning it because someone will ask. So no, there's no multiplayer. I mean, just think about it, of course there isn't. Visually, this thing is just stunning to look at. The environments get really dark, making the torch extremely useful, and the lighting effects are really quite impressive all around. It gave me some serious Nightmare Creatures vibes. No, not night creatures, thank you very much. And there are some environmental changes that occur during the final stretch that work super well. The characters all look great with fantastic animations. Ascending ladders can get a bit jittery, but this is an option that can be toggled. It blows my mind that someone created this in just over a year. The additions and tweaks make this feel like a side story to the official release with a satisfying conclusion that makes sense in this new old world. I don't want to spoil too much here, but if you like Bloodborne, this thing is a gift. Someone created this thing in 13 months. It's also free, so there's really no excuse to not check it out. Lilith has created an adventure that is both familiar and entirely new. A kart racer is in the works based off of this property, and I'm eager to give that a shot when it drops. Until then, I encourage all of you to download this thing. It's a remarkable effort that shouldn't go unnoticed. With the way Sony operates, this might be the only time we get to see this game on a PC, so drink it in. Next time on this channel, an official From Software game, so stay tuned.
Wheel. 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 Wheel louder.